We have more for your ears only. I'm Catherine Herzog.
I'm David Alpern with this quote from the news. It seems like the best report money can buy. That was Connecticut Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal on the GM internal investigation that blamed an irresponsible corporate culture for the 10-year delay in recalling cars with flawed ignition switches linked to at least 13 deaths and led to the firing of 15 company employees last week, but cleared current President Mary T. Barra, a longtime GM executive, and her top aides. Now this.
The administration has set out to kill coal and its 800,000 jobs. If it succeeds in death by regulation, we'll all be paying a lot more money for electricity if we can get it.
I don't think there's any war on coal at all. What this is a realization that the climate is changing, that carbon dioxide emissions have an impact on that, and that the largest source of carbon emissions is from coal-fired power plants.
Wyoming's Republican Senator Mike Enzi and Kentucky's Democratic Congressman John Yarmuth had predictably partisan differences of opinion about the tougher new limits on power plant emissions and other carbon controls proposed by the administration as executive actions to sidestep congressional paralysis.
Even supporters of the new standards admit they will cause economic and employment disruptions, but they note offsetting benefits as well. And at least 10 states already have cut carbon emissions by the 30% President Obama proposed. Veteran journalist Tom Zeller, Jr., a specialist on the intersection of science and politics, reviewed the pros and cons for the Bloomberg View. And for your ears only, he joins us now. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, David.
Let's start with the administration sidestepping Congress. What are the prospects for this executive action standing up in court?
On the one hand, the EPA is turning to a rather seldom used provision in the Clean Air Act in order to make these rules. And that's the basis for opponents' arguments going forward. They argue that provision doesn't give them the authority to make these sorts of sweeping rules. On the flip side, though, courts have traditionally found in favor of the EPA in past challenges to related rules. So there's some reason to expect that the courts will uphold this authority as well, though it's going to take a long time to sort that out.
And what do the most recent polls say about public sentiment on the kinds of controls Obama has proposed?
Well, there's lots of evidence that the public supports these measures. I looked at just one survey conducted by Yale University, and the numbers were pretty straightforward. There was something like, I think it was something like 64% of respondents support regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant, even if it meant that their electricity bills would go up. And of course, if you break that down along partisan lines, it changes a bit. But even when they asked if you just simply supported regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant, that number was 68%, and I think it even included like 60% of Republicans. So there's clear support for this idea.
Let's talk more about costs. The Chamber of Commerce last week predicted even greater losses than Senator Enzi in jobs and energy expenses in the long term. Remind us.
I think they predicted something like $51 billion on average every year would be lost in GDP. To over 200,000 fewer jobs every year through 2030. A huge loss in disposable income. Over $500 billion was predicted by the chamber.
And the American Petroleum Institute was even more apocalyptic about the prospects for U.S. business if the EPA should target similar executive action against other polluting chemicals. Remind us about that.
Yeah, that's right. So those rules have to do with emissions of chemicals related to ground-level ozone. And the American Petroleum Institute published a report suggesting that pretty much every community in the United States would suffer economic hardship if these rules were put into place. I think they called them, quote, the costliest EPA regulations ever. I think I have that right.
On the other hand, we've heard pessimistic predictions like this in the past, notably in the 1970s when the Clean Air Act took aim at automobile emissions. What were the warnings then? What actually happened?
Well, they read almost verbatim to the warnings that you hear now. I wrote about an example from the auto industry warning in 1970 that cars would no longer be produced, that people would not be able to have cars within 5 years. And the same arguments were made when the Clean Water Act was introduced in 72, the Endangered Species Act, the Montreal Protocol in 1987. And yet since 1970, gross domestic product has increased by something like 200%. Vehicle miles traveled have increased by 167%. We've added 88% more private sector jobs while cutting pollution. So, I think the numbers sort of speak for themselves on that front.
And you note that the doomsayers often ignore the cost of not controlling pollution in terms of health care and lost workdays, quite apart from global warming.
Yeah, that's a whole other side of it that doesn't really get quantified, and partly because it's difficult to do, but there's no question that reducing illnesses associated with air pollution have ancillary benefits that I think the complaints often fail to take into account. One study that I cited in the piece that I wrote suggested that these regulations since 1990 had prevented some 160,000 premature deaths, 100,000 heart attacks, millions of cases of bronchitis. And other folks have tried to put dollar values on that. One study from the Harvard School of Public Health estimated maybe as much as $500 billion just attributed to the cost of coal making us sick. So, and of course, those estimates don't even include the impacts of global warming and other pollution impacts, so it's almost certainly higher than that.
Critics of the new carbon constraints say they amount to picking favorites in the alternative energy field. But what might that mean for creation of new jobs and ultimately cheaper energy from free sources like the sun and wind if they gain momentum?
Yeah, well, it makes sense that as it becomes harder and more costly for power generators to dump carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, a lot of investment will be driven towards finding either technologies that can prevent that CO2 from getting out before it's released, or alternatives to fuels that produce CO2 in the first place. And so there's almost certain that these regulations will drive more investment and certainly more jobs in that area. It's also worth noting that the nuclear industry is very excited about these new rules too, being a low carbon fuel source. Certainly nuclear is pulling out all the stops and creating a big lobbying campaign to identify itself as a low carbon option. Nuclear power, although, is an extremely expensive investment. So if I were a betting person, I don't know how things will spin, I would see more investment going towards renewable technologies.
You also say the traditional energy industry might have had an easier time now if they had not opposed earlier administration legislative proposals on carbon.
Yeah, well, it's a question worth raising. Folks will remember that a comprehensive climate bill was an intense focus of Congress when Obama first came into office. And by 2009, legislation had actually passed in the House. It ultimately died in the Senate for a variety of reasons, but among them was opposition from the same industry groups that we're hearing from now. And it's arguable that House bill that passed, which had a lot of concessions for industry, might have been easier to deal with. But that's ancient history now.
Veteran journalist Tom Zeller, Jr. is a specialist on the intersection of science and politics for the Bloomberg View.
Here's a quote from the news. At a certain point, I thought I would explode, but I knew that even if I used my loudest voice, I would just disappear in a minute. That was Tiananmen Square protest veteran Xiao Fengso, surprised that he was permitted to return for its 25th anniversary, but sure he could not overcome the government crackdown on any outward observance of an event many young Chinese don't even know about.
Next, TV's Dr. McDreamy and crowdsourcing real-world diagnoses for your ears only.